What if I told you that the warm, familiar drink billions of people depend on every morning once helped collapse an entire political system? That one crop became so intertwined with a nation's economy, culture, and identity that when the market shifted, it pulled the entire country down with it. This is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. It is the true story of how coffee, just coffee, bankrupted Brazil's old republic. Not by accident, but by design. And the deeper you go into this story, the more shocking it becomes, because behind every bean shipped across the Atlantic was a financial gamble, a political pact, and an economic time bomb that would eventually explode. To understand how this disaster unfolded, you have to understand Brazil at the dawn of the 20th century. Few countries on earth have ever controlled a commodity the way Brazil controlled coffee. Walking through São Paulo in 1905 felt like visiting a kingdom built entirely from beans, elegant cafes on every corner, mansions constructed from coffee profits, politicians whose campaigns were funded by plantation barons. Students joked that you could follow the smell of roasted coffee and find the source of Brazil's political power, and in a way, they were right. Brazil didn't just produce coffee, Brazil was coffee. Its national budget depended on it. Its railways were built to transport it. Even its currency value rose and fell with the price of coffee in New York and London. The ruling political alliance of the time, known as coffee with milk, symbolized this dominance. São Paulo, the land of coffee, and Minas Gerais, the land of dairy, controlled the presidency through an informal rotation. And as long as coffee prices stayed high, the arrangement looked stable, even brilliant. Brazil had found its golden goose, and the goose never seemed to stop laying eggs. This confidence would become the root of the empire's downfall. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Coffee is not an easy crop. A tree takes years to mature, but once it does, it produces relentlessly. If you plant too much today, you create a flood in the future. And Brazil planted too much. Every year, new immigrants were brought in to work plantations. New lands were cleared. New rail lines were built to push deeper into the interior. The logic seemed simple: produce as much as possible, sell as much as possible, earn as much as possible. Except that markets don't work like that. When supply rises faster than demand, prices fall. And when prices fall, economies built on a single commodity begin to shake. By the late 1990s, worldwide coffee prices had already begun sliding. Countries like Colombia, Guatemala, and Costa Rica were slowly increasing their own production. European tastes were changing, but Brazilian leaders refused to believe that their era of dominance could end, so instead they intervened. In 1906, Brazil launched one of the most ambitious economic experiments in history, the Valorization Scheme. The plan was breathtakingly bold. Whenever global prices dropped, the government would buy up millions of pounds of unsold coffee using borrowed foreign money. They would store the beans, reduce apparent supply, and force prices back up. It was a financial theater, a performance meant to convince the world that coffee was still scarce and valuable. The early results were astonishing. Prices rose, farmers celebrated, politicians claimed victory, foreign investors applauded what they saw as a modern, intelligent government. But the success was an illusion, because the scheme solved nothing. The core issue, overproduction, remained untouched. In fact, it grew worse, because if farmers knew the government would rescue them whenever prices fell, why not plant more? Why not expand? Why not double down on the crop that the government had essentially declared too important to fail? And so the cycle tightened. More coffee led to lower prices. Lower prices triggered more buying. More buying required more loans. More loans encouraged even more planting. By the mid-1920s, Brazil was producing far beyond what the world could consume. Warehouses in Santos and Rio de Janeiro overflowed. Mountains of beans formed literal walls inside storage depots. Ships were parked indefinitely, filled to the brim with coffee. And yet, year after year, plantation owners planted more. Foreign bankers grew nervous but continued lending because the Brazilian government had never defaulted. They believed a nation as rich as Brazil could not possibly fall. What they didn't see was that Brazil's wealth existed only on paper. There were no large-scale industries, no diversified exports, no alternative economic engines. Brazil was tying its national future to the price of a drink that millions could simply stop buying if money got tight. No one imagined that a global crisis was coming. That crisis arrived in 1929. When the U.S. stock market crashed, it set off a chain reaction that circled the planet. Factories closed, workers were fired, imports dried up, luxury goods collapsed in demand, and coffee, which had been treated as an economic constant, was suddenly a luxury millions could no longer justify. Consumption dropped almost overnight. Buyers disappeared. Contracts were canceled. Brazil's most valuable export turned into a product stacked uselessly in warehouses. The Brazilian government attempted the same solution it had always used: buy more coffee. But this time there was no foreign credit. Banks in London and New York were failing themselves. No one was willing to lend money for what looked like an obviously collapsing market. Brazil found itself trapped, and soon the reality became unbearable. The country could not sell its product, it could not pay its debts, it could not maintain the currency, and worst of all, the public began to realize that the entire economy had been built on a fragile and deeply unstable foundation. Desperation produced one of the most extraordinary acts in economic history. The government ordered coffee destroyed to artificially shrink supply. It sounds impossible, but it happened. Millions of bags were dumped into the ocean. Entire trainloads were burned as fuel. Locomotives ran on roasted beans because coal was too expensive. Officials watched fires consume Brazil's wealth, hoping the spectacle would somehow save them. But global prices did not rise. They continued falling. The plantation barons who once dictated national policy lost everything. Workers abandoned plantations, many walking hundreds of miles to cities in search of food. Banks shuttered. Middle-class families watched their savings evaporate. Inflation crept into daily life, and the political system, already weakened by regional tensions, finally collapsed. In 1930, a revolution erupted. Getúlio Vargas, backed by military officers and disgruntled state leaders, overthrew the government. The old republic, which had governed Brazil for 40 decades, died quietly, without a civil war, undone not by political enemies, but by economic mismanagement. Vargas promised modernization, industrialization, and diversification. He vowed that Brazil would never again be chained to a single crop. And although the changes took decades to unfold, the lesson from the coffee collapse became a permanent scar in Brazil's political consciousness. It proved something essential about economies. Prosperity that depends on one export is not prosperity at all. It is a bet, a gamble, a hope that the world will never change. But the world always changes. Demand shifts, markets move, new competitors arise, and when an economy stands on one leg, even the smallest tremor can shatter everything. Brazil learned this the hard way. Coffee had once made the nation rich, but wealth without stability is a mirage, and when the illusion broke, it dragged down an entire political order. Today, whenever economists warn about commodity dependence, whether it's oil in Venezuela, gas in Russia, or lithium in developing nations, they are echoing the warning Brazil wrote in Fire a century ago. Never trust a single crop, never trust a single export, never trust a single market. Because coffee does not care about empires, beans do not care about politics, and no product, no matter how beloved, can carry a nation forever. The story of how coffee bankrupted Brazil is not just history, it is prophecy, a reminder that the most powerful nations can fall not through war or invasion, but through the quiet, steady decay of overconfidence in a product the world can live without. Brazil believed coffee guaranteed its future. Instead, coffee delivered its collapse.